When I want a more casual dress and I don't want to add lining, I usually finish the seams with a Hong Kong finish just to add a couture touch. Hi, I'm Angela Wolf, and we're back to making the little black dress. As you can tell by the dresses behind me, I'm using different colors, different designs, just to give you a lot of ideas, plus you can see them better. But let me give you some ideas for some seam finishes. On a typical outfit in ready-to-wear, usually you just have the seam, it's sewn, pressed open, and the edges are serged. That's really easy, fast to do, but what if you want a little couture touch? What about a Hong Kong finish? Here you go. It's wrapped with bias tape. What a great look. So let me show you how to do that. I just have a few pieces of fabric here. I'm not going to do a whole seam, but I always mark the wrong sides of my fabric with an X so I don't accidentally sew the wrong side. So all you're going to need is with the fabric on the right side up, and then you're going to need a piece of bias. Bias, you can tell it stretches. Now I just cut this 2 inches wide. You're going to trim the back anyway, so just 2 inches is a safe bet. If you want it a little bit wider, that's fine. One thing though, if you've seen me in past lessons, a lot of times I'll stretch the bias a little bit while we're sewing it. This case, we're not going to. Otherwise, it's going to make your seams ripple. So let's do the first side. We have the right side of the garment and our bias strip. So we have right sides together. Go to the sewing machine, and depending on your seam allowance, just make sure it's smaller than your seam allowance because you don't want to see this from the right side of the garment. So I'm going to go 1/2 inch here. And I'm just going to stitch this right onto the edge of the fabric. So this would be your seam allowance along this edge here. I'm not pulling, remember, otherwise your seams will pucker like that. So I'm just going to lay this on top and just sew. You really don't need pins for this. Just sew, make sure that the edges meet up. There we go. Now this is going to be pressed like this and fold over, just like this. This is the process, okay? So let me do this to the other side. Again, 1/2 inch. Now don't use too small of a seam on this, like as far as a stitch. I would go with a 2.5 to a 3.0 on this. Okay, we have 2. Now I'm going to go press these to one side and fold this over and press. So here we go. Just press this to one side. Use your clapper to make sure it's a nice sturdy. There we go. Perfect. And then fold this over just like that and fold it like this and press. So I'm wrapping that seam with this bias. Just like that. I'm going to press the other one because you obviously have 2 seams that are going to be sewn together. Press this way. So I'm folding this raw edge to the wrong side of the fabric. You can see my little X on here, reminding myself that I have this sewn correctly. Okay, back to the sewing machine. So here I have, this was sewn on. We flip this over, just like that. I'm making this really wide for you. I think on the other sample that I had up here, this sample, you can see the difference. This one's much wider. But I just want to make sure you can see this really well. Fold this under. Now I'm not double folding it, I'm only single folding it. And you have 2 options here. You can either stitch right along the edge of this bias tape, or you can stitch what they call stitch in the ditch, which is along the fabric. I kind of like doing it right on the silk, so that's what I'm going to do. And just stitch. There's really no need to backstitch because this is just a finish on the seam. At each end, you're going to be hemming or serging or something at each end anyway, so just stitch. Just like that. Perfect. Let's do the other one. Set this right here out of the way. Now we're going to press that again. Stitch this one. all the way to the end. I'm not sure if you can see the white thread. I think you can, but you can see my stitch line right along the edge of this bias. So now we have the bias attached. Looks like I lost a little bit there, so I would fix that. That's what I get for making this wider for you. Let's look at this one. This one's much better. And we have this little extra here, which we're going to trim that off when we're finished sewing our seam. Go back and press these again. So now this is the right side of the fabric I'm pressing from. Again, using the clapper. So here we would have both of our seams, just like this. I would trim off the excess of the bias. Just like that. So now we have right side of the garment. So our ends are finished, just like if we serged them. So I would flip this over, just like this. This is the one that looks better, by the way. And we're going to run that. I'm going to make this a really wide seam allowance so you can see this. And just stitch, as if you were stitching your seam for your garment. I'm not stitching on the silk. I'm stitching right next to it. Now, if you had a really narrow seam here, you could go ahead and trim this. Just slide your scissors up the edge. Nobody's going to see this part, so it doesn't matter if it's crooked. It doesn't matter what you have back there. I'm only going to trim off some of it because this isn't touching. It's not going to bother me. I know you're going to ask, so why don't you flip this over twice like a bias binding? Well, you could, but then you have a whole extra thickness of fabric. So check this out. See how nice that looks? So I'm just going to press that one more time. So now you can see, here's our wrong sides of the fabric. Here's this. Perfect. There's our seam. So there's the Hong Kong finish. Have fun with that. It really doesn't take as long as you think. Now what about the really nice top stitching? Both dresses behind me with the khaki and the jean have top stitching. The seam was sewn, just like I'm going to show you, pressed to one side and top stitched. So I'm just going to sew a seam here, as if I was sewing my garment. See that? I've already done that because I prefer to serge. Now, if you don't have a serger, you can finish your edge with a zigzag stitch or something else, but I've already finished this with a serger, pressed it to one side, and here we have our seam, just like this. So now, here is the top stitching. Always when you top stitch, make sure that you use a longer stitch. I usually use 3.5 to 4.5. This machine goes all the way up to 6 and 7. I don't go that far. But let's just say we're going to use a 4. Whatever your machine goes to, just try it and see how it looks. Now this stitch is with one spool of thread and just a straight stitch. And I'm stitching right next to about 1/8 of an inch to the seam. Stitch a little slow here. The important part when you're top stitching is to make sure that the stitch is straight. See how nice that looks? So some of my garments, like the denim one, has only one line of stitching. The khaki one has one. Sometimes I'll do 2 lines of stitching. Just make sure that your needle is the same distance away from your first stitch line. So this is almost like sewing denim, like you see on jeans. This actually is the seam that I do on a lot of my jeans. See how nice that looks? Now that's just regular thread. Now in the last lesson we talked about different threads. They have buttonhole thread, they have top stitching thread. Top stitching thread looks great on this. Another option is to do the triple stitch. If you have that on your sewing machine, it just looks like 3 lines next to each other. That makes a great top stitch. Again, going back to the 4.0, as high as your machine will go. I have one that goes to 4 and one goes to 4.5. So that's a great stitch. Another one is to run 2 spools of thread through everything. I've shown you that before, where you just take this and you just thread your machine, both with the 2 spools of thread. That makes a really nice stitch. And those are 3 really good seams for making your little black dress.